Marcus Chen's hands trembled as he held the green stone up to the Colorado sunlight, scarcely believing what his trained geological eye was telling him. After 23 years in the field, he knew emerald when he saw it. But emerald of this quality, in this quantity, seemed impossible. Just 6 months ago, he'd been a desperate, unemployed geologist who'd risked his family's grocery money on flood-damaged land that everyone called worthless. Now, standing in the carved-out channel where spring floods had exposed a geological treasure beyond his wildest dreams, Marcus understood that his desperate gamble was about to change everything. But the story of how he'd gotten here began with empty coffee cups and mounting desperation. "Daddy's still looking for work," he heard Emma whisper to her sister Sophie through the thin walls. "Why can't he just get a job at the grocery store like Mrs. Henderson's husband?" Sophie whispered back. Marcus closed his eyes and felt the familiar weight settle in his chest. 2 master's degrees, one in geology, another in environmental science, and here he was, reduced to a cautionary tale his 7-year-old daughters discussed in hushed tones. The layoffs at Meridian Mining had come swift and merciless, eliminating Marcus's department with corporate efficiency. His phone buzzed with a text from his brother-in-law. "Still nothing? My buddy at the construction company might have something. It's manual labor, but it pays." If you're enjoying this story of Marcus's journey from desperation to discovery, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe for more incredible true stories that will inspire and amaze you. "Find anything?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "The few possibilities," Marcus lied, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "There's a consulting position in Colorado Springs that looks promising." Sarah poured herself coffee, her back turned to him as she spoke. "Marcus, we need to talk about reality here. The girls need new winter coats, the car needs an inspection, and the mortgage—" "I know," he interrupted, perhaps more sharply than he intended. "You think I don't know?" She turned to face him then, and he saw something in her expression that frightened him more than any past due notice ever could. A weariness that went deeper than lack of sleep, a resignation that suggested she was already making calculations about what came next. "I'm trying, Sarah. Every day. I'm trying." "I know you are." But there was something unsaid hanging in the air between them, heavy as storm clouds. "The girls are ready for school. I'm picking up an extra shift tonight." After Sarah left with Emma and Sophie, their cheerful goodbyes echoing from the driveway, Marcus found himself alone with his thoughts and the oppressive weight of silence. He wandered through their house, a modest 3-bedroom ranch they'd bought when his career was ascending and the future looked bright with possibility. Now every room seemed to mock him with its normalcy, its assumption that life would continue as planned. In his study, geological samples from past fieldwork lined wooden shelves like memories made manifest. Chunks of granite from the Rockies, limestone from Texas, quartz formations from half a dozen states, each one telling a story of the Earth's ancient history, of pressure and time and transformation. He picked up a piece of mica schist, feeling its familiar weight, remembering the excitement of discovery that had first drawn him to geology 23 years ago. His laptop chimed with an email notification, and Marcus returned to the kitchen with reluctant steps. Most emails these days fell into 2 categories: automated rejections from companies that had never seriously considered his application, or increasingly urgent notices from creditors who cared nothing for his circumstances. But this email was different. Subject: Distressed property auction, final day, reduced reserve prices. Marcus almost deleted it. He'd somehow gotten on several real estate mailing lists during his job search, probably through career websites that sold user data to anyone willing to pay. But something made him pause, perhaps the word reduced, or maybe just the desperate hope that had become his constant companion. But Marcus saw something else in those photos. The way the earth had been carved, the exposed rock faces, the drainage patterns. It all spoke to him in the language he'd learned to read over 2 decades in the field. This wasn't just damaged land. It was opened land, revealed land, its secrets scraped bare by nature's violence. The auction would end in 6 hours. Marcus spent the morning researching everything he could find about the property. Tax records showed it had been owned by an elderly rancher who died 2 years ago, his estate finally settling. The floods that had damaged it were part of the same system that had devastated parts of Colorado the previous spring, turning normally docile creeks into raging torrents that reshaped entire valleys. County geological maps showed the area was part of an alluvial deposit zone, exactly the kind of formation where interesting minerals could accumulate over geological time. The original surveys mentioned in the listing were brief, conducted 15 years ago for a proposed development that never materialized, but they noted unusual mineralogical composition and further investigation recommended. By afternoon, Marcus had convinced himself this was either the opportunity of a lifetime or the final, decisive step in his journey toward complete financial ruin. $250 represented a significant portion of their remaining savings, money that could buy groceries for 2 weeks or keep the electricity on for another month. But as he sat at his kitchen table, staring at the auction website's countdown timer, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in months. The electric tingle of possibility. Maybe it was desperation masquerading as intuition, or maybe it was the voice of a man who'd spent his career reading the stories the earth told to anyone patient enough to listen. With 20 minutes left in the auction, Marcus created an account and entered his bid, $250. The next 20 minutes passed like hours. He refreshed the page obsessively, watching his other bidders enter the fray. The price climbed, $275, $300, $350. Each increase felt like a physical blow, pushing this long-shot dream further from his reach. With 3 minutes remaining, Marcus placed a final bid, $425, nearly double his original limit and money he couldn't afford to lose. The countdown reached 0. Congratulations! You were the winning bidder for lot 247. Marcus stared at the screen until the words stopped making sense, then stared some more. Somewhere in Colorado, in a flood-ravaged valley he'd never seen, 47 acres of damaged earth now belonged to him. He owned land again, not the suburban quarter-acre that came with his mortgage, but real, raw, honest land that stretched beyond what he could walk in an hour. The immediate practical concerns crashed over him like a secondary flood. How would he explain this to Sarah? How would he even get to Colorado to see what he'd bought? What exactly did a person do with 47 acres of flood-damaged wasteland? But underneath the panic and uncertainty, something else was stirring, a feeling Marcus had almost forgotten existed. For the first time in 8 months, he was no longer just waiting for life to happen to him. He had taken action, made a choice, rolled the dice on a future that existed somewhere beyond the narrow confines of rejection letters and overdue bills. Outside, storm clouds were gathering on horizon, promising rain that would fall on earth that now belonged to him, somewhere out there in the vast, complicated, beautiful world beyond his kitchen table. Marcus closed his laptop and began to plan his first trip to Colorado. The silence that followed Marcus's confession stretched between him and Sarah like a chasm carved by years of small disappointments. She stood at their kitchen sink, her hands gripping the edge of the counter with enough force that her knuckles had gone white. Outside, the evening light was fading, casting their familiar kitchen in the kind of golden glow that usually made everything seem peaceful and possible. Instead, it illuminated the growing distance between them. $425, Sarah repeated, her voice carrying a flatness that Marcus had come to dread more than her anger. On land you've never seen, in a state we can't afford to visit. Sarah, if you could just look at the geological surveys. Stop. She turned to face him, and Marcus saw something break in her expression. Just stop with the geology talk.
Stop with the big dreams and the technical explanations and the "someday this will all make sense" speeches. We needed that money for groceries, for the girls' school supplies, for the electric bill that's due tomorrow. Marcus felt the familiar frustration rising in his chest, the same feeling he'd battled every day since the layoffs began. I know it seems crazy, but this could be... Could be what? Could be another one of your brilliant investments? Like the mining stock that was going to pay for the girls' college? Or the consulting business you were going to start with Jim before he moved to Seattle and left you holding a lease on office space we couldn't afford? The words hit him like physical blows, each one accurate and devastating. Marcus looked down at his hands, noting the calluses that had softened during his months of unemployment, the wedding ring that felt heavier each day as he struggled to fulfill the promises it represented. "This is different," he said quietly. "The geological indicators, the way the flood exposed the subsurface layers. It's dirt, Marcus." Sarah's voice cracked, and he realized she was crying now, tears of exhaustion and fear that had been building for months. "It's 47 acres of worthless, flooded dirt that we can't afford to own and can't afford to develop and can't afford to keep paying taxes on." That night, Marcus lay awake listening to Sarah's carefully controlled breathing beside him. He knew she wasn't sleeping either, knew she was running calculations in her head, bills versus income, necessities versus luxuries, the shrinking gap between what they had and what they needed. He wanted to reach for her, to offer comfort or seek forgiveness, but the space between them felt unbridgeable. Emma's cough from the next room reminded him of the doctor's visit they'd postponed because their insurance had a high deductible they couldn't meet. Sophie's request for new sneakers that they'd deflected with promises of maybe next month. The 1,000 small compromises that had become their daily reality, all of which made his land purchase seem not bold, but selfish, not visionary, but delusional. But as the hours passed and dawn approached, Marcus found his mind returning to those grainy photos, to the exposed rock faces and the drainage patterns that spoke to him in a language he'd learned to trust. 23 years of fieldwork had taught him to read the stories written in stone and soil, to see possibilities where others only saw problems. Every instant he'd developed as a geologist told him there was more to that Colorado property than flood damage and failed development dreams. The next morning brought fresh challenges and mounting bills they couldn't afford. "Dad, are we poor?" Sophie asked over dinner, her 7-year-old directness cutting through the careful adult pretenses they'd tried to maintain. Marcus looked at his daughter, really looked at her, taking in the 2 small shoes she'd grown out of months ago, the carefully mended tear in her favorite sweater, the way she'd learned to eat slowly to make her portions last longer. When had he stopped seeing these details? When had providing for his family become so abstract that he could spend their grocery money on a dream? "We're going through a tough time," he said carefully, "but we're going to be okay." "Is that why you bought the land? To make us not poor anymore?" The question hit him with unexpected force. Out of the mouths of babes, he thought, realizing that his 7-year-old daughter had grasped something Sarah couldn't see, that his seemingly irrational purchase had been an act of desperate hope rather than reckless abandonment of responsibility. "I bought the land because sometimes, when everything seems impossible, you have to believe in something, and I believe that land has secrets worth discovering." That weekend, while Sarah worked at double shift at the hospital, Marcus spent hours researching everything he could find about his Colorado property. He studied geological maps, rainfall patterns, mining history of the region, flood documentation from the previous spring. He called the county assessor's office, the local extension agent, even the fire department to ask about road access during different seasons. What emerged was a picture of land that had been undervalued and overlooked precisely because of its challenges. The seasonal flooding had kept developers away, but it had also done something else. It had stripped away decades of topsoil and debris, exposing underlying geological formations that hadn't seen daylight since the last major flood cycle 30 years before. The more Marcus learned, the more convinced he became that he needed to see this land in person. But a trip to Colorado meant gas money, hotel costs, time away from job searching, expenses and complications their family couldn't afford. He was trapped in the classical catch-22 of poverty, too broke to take the risks that might lead to opportunity. It was Emma who provided the solution, though she didn't know it at the time. "Can we go camping this summer?" she asked one evening while Marcus helped her with homework. "Jenny's family went to Colorado and she said it was really pretty." Camping. Marcus felt something click into place. He still had most of his geological field equipment stored in the garage: core sampling tools, portable testing kits, survey instruments that represented thousands of dollars of investment from his previous career. If he could plan a camping trip that looked like a family vacation, but was actually a reconnaissance mission. The idea felt deceptive, and Marcus wrestled with the ethics of it for days. Was he manipulating his family into enabling his obsession, or was he finding a creative solution that could serve multiple purposes, giving the girls a small adventure, showing Sarah he wasn't completely reckless, and allowing him to properly evaluate his investment? Sarah's reaction to his camping proposal was predictable skepticism. "We don't have money for a vacation, Marcus." "It wouldn't be expensive. Camping fees are minimal, we'd pack our own food, drive straight there and back. The girls have never seen the Rocky Mountains. And coincidentally, we'd happen to drive past your new property." Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks. "I thought it might be good for all of us to get away, see something different. Remember what it feels like to be a family without all this stress." Sarah studied his face for a long moment, and he saw something shift in her expression. Not acceptance exactly, but maybe recognition of his genuine desire to repair what had been damaged between them. "2 nights, she said finally. "And we're not camping on your land. We find a real campground with facilities." "Deal."
"We'll teach them to identify different rock types," he told Sarah as he loaded a portable geological testing kit into the trunk. "Make it a learning experience." Sarah watched him work with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You really believe in this, don't you? This land purchase?" Marcus paused, a camping lantern halfway into the car. "I believe that sometimes the earth gives up its secrets to people who know how to look. And I believe that everything I've learned in 23 years of field work is pointing me towards something significant." "And if you're wrong?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Marcus could give her the practical answer, that they'd lose $425 they couldn't afford to lose, that he'd prove himself to be the dreamer she feared he was becoming, that their marriage might not survive another failure of his judgment. Instead, he gave her the truth. "If I'm wrong, then I'm wrong about everything. About my ability to read geological formations, about my understanding of mineralogical processes, about the instincts I've spent my entire career developing. And if I'm wrong about all of that, then I don't know who I am anymore." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice carried a gentleness she hadn't heard in months. "Then, I guess we'd better hope you're right." The night before their departure, Marcus lay in bed making mental inventories of everything he would look for once they reached Colorado. Quartz veins that might indicate hydrothermal activity, unusual coloration in exposed rock faces, drainage patterns that suggested interesting geological events, the weight and texture of sediments in the creek bed, evidence of the mineralogical composition that the original survey had found noteworthy. As the first light of dawn crept through their bedroom windows,
Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in months: the anticipation of discovery. Tomorrow he would finally see the land that had become the repository of all his hopes and fears. Tomorrow he would find out if he was a visionary or a fool. The distinction, he was beginning to understand, might determine not just his financial future, but the survival of everything he'd built with Sarah, everything he wanted to preserve for Emma and Sophie, everything that made him the man he'd always believed himself to be. Marcus rose before his alarm, showered quietly so as not to wake his family, and began loading the car for what felt like the most important journey of his life. The Colorado sky stretched endless and blue above them as the Honda Civic climbed through the foothills of the Rocky Mountains, its aging engine working harder with each mile of elevation gained. Emma and Sophie pressed their faces against the windows, pointing excitedly at formations Marcus recognized as Mesozoic sedimentary layers, sandstone and shale deposited when this whole area lay beneath an ancient sea. For the first time in months, his daughter's laughter filled the car with something approaching joy. "Look at that one, Dad," Sophie called out, gesturing toward a red rock outcrop. "It looks like a castle." "That's Dakota sandstone," Marcus explained, falling into the comfortable rhythm of teaching. "It was formed about 100 million years ago when this whole area was covered by a shallow sea. See all those layers? Each one tells the story of a different time period." Sarah glanced at him from the passenger seat, and she caught something in his expression. Not quite approval, but maybe recognition of the man she'd fallen in love with, the passionate geologist who could make rocks tell stories. It was the first time he'd felt like himself in months. They reached Willow Creek Campground as the afternoon sun painted the surrounding peaks in shades of gold and amber. The girls threw themselves into the business of exploration with the boundless energy of children freed from suburban constraints, while Marcus and Sarah worked together to set up their borrowed tent with a cooperation that felt almost normal.
"It's beautiful here," Sarah admitted as they watched Emma chase grasshoppers through the meadow grass. "I'd forgotten how big the world could feel." Marcus knew what she meant. The vastness of the landscape, the sense of geological time that rendered their immediate problems both significant and trivial. The reminder that they were part of something larger than mortgage payments and job applications, and the claustrophobic anxiety of financial desperation. But even as he appreciated the moment, Marcus felt the magnetic pull of his property just 15 miles to the north. According to his research, the access road was passable this time of year, though it would require careful driving. His geological equipment sat in the trunk like a secret, waiting for the opportunity he'd been planning since they left home. That opportunity came the next morning when Sarah suggested taking the girls to a nearby tourist attraction, a reconstructed mining town complete with gold-panning demonstrations and staged gunfights. "You should come with us," she said, but something in her tone suggested she was offering him an escape rather than insisting on togetherness. "I thought I might do some exploring on my own, maybe check out some of the geological formations we passed yesterday, take some photos for the girls." Sarah studied his face, and he knew she understood exactly what kind of exploring he had in mind. After 22 years of marriage, she could read his intentions as clearly as he could read rock strata. "Be careful," she said finally. "And Marcus, don't do anything stupid." The 15-mile drive to his property took Marcus through country that grew progressively more remote and wild. Paved roads gave way to gravel, then to dirt tracks that seemed to dissolve into the landscape itself. His GPS signal flickered and died as he navigated by landmarks, a distinctive rock formation here, a creek crossing there, the ghost of an old fence line that matched the property descriptions he'd memorized. When he finally found the access road marked by a weathered, no trespassing sign that he was now legally entitled to ignore, Marcus felt his heart rate increase with something between excitement and terror. This was it, the moment of truth that would determine whether his investment was inspired or insane. The road was worse than he had expected. Weeks of late summer thunderstorms had carved deep ruts and scattered debris across the track, forcing Marcus to drive at walking speed while his car's undercarriage scraped ominously against hidden rocks. More than once he considered turning back, but each time the road would improve just enough to encourage him forward. After 20 minutes of careful navigation, the trees opened up and Marcus got his first real look at his property. He stopped the car and sat in stunned silence, trying to process what lay before him. The flood damage was spectacular and devastating. What had once been a gentle valley carved by Willow Creek was now a moonscape of raw geology. The creek itself had jumped its banks and carved entirely new channels, leaving behind a maze of gullies, exposed boulders, and debris frills that stretched as far as he could see. Trees lay scattered like matchsticks, their root systems creating abstract sculptures of earth and twisted wood. But what caught Marcus's attention immediately was something the photographs hadn't captured: the color of the exposed rock faces. Where the flood had carved away soil and vegetation, it had revealed stone that gleamed with an unusual iridescence, shot through with veins of mineral deposits that caught and reflected the morning light in ways that made his pulse quicken.
Spectrometer, field testing kits, cameras, GPS units, sample bags, the tools of his former trade that he'd maintained with religious care even when he couldn't afford to use them professionally. The first samples he collected came from a stream bed where the flood had scoured away everything but bedrock. The stone was unlike anything in his mental catalog, a metamorphic formation with characteristics that suggested both extreme pressure and hydrothermal alteration. Under his field lens, he could see crystalline structures that made his breath catch in his throat. Marcus worked systematically, documenting GPS coordinates for each sample, photographing formations from multiple angles, taking detailed notes that would allow him to reconstruct his findings later. This was field work at its purest. No corporate deadlines, no bureaucratic oversight, just a geologist and the stories written in stone. As the morning progressed, his excitement grew with each new discovery. The mineral veins weren't random. They followed clear patterns that suggested a single geological event of extraordinary magnitude. The hydrothermal alteration was extensive and recent in geological terms, probably occurring within the last few million years when this region was still geologically active. But it was the fourth sample site that stopped him cold. Marcus had been working his way upstream, following a newly carved channel that exposed a cross-section of the subsurface geology like a textbook diagram come to life. The walls of the channel showed clear stratification, layers of sedimentary rock topped by metamorphic formations that told the story of millions of years of geological activity. But embedded in the metamorphic layer, just at eye level, something caught the light with an intensity that made him forget to breathe. Green. Not the green of oxidized copper or weathered feldspar, but a green that seemed to glow with its own internal fire. Marcus approached slowly, his field training warring with an excitement that threatened to overwhelm his scientific objectivity. He'd seen similar coloration before, in graduate school and in museums, but never in the field, never in a context that suggested large deposits rather than isolated specimens. His hand shook as he extracted a sample from the formation, being careful to document its exact position and orientation. Under his field lens, the greenstone showed the telltale signs of beryl, the hexagonal crystal structure, the glassy luster, the incredible hardness that made it difficult to scratch even with a steel knife. And the color, that impossible green that seemed to pulse with internal light, could only mean one thing: emerald. Not just emerald, but emerald of a quality that made his professional expertise scream with possibilities he hardly dared consider. Marcus forced himself to continue working methodically, taking multiple samples from the same formation, documenting everything with obsessive detail. But as he moved along the exposed face, the scope of what he was seeing began to overwhelm his ability to maintain scientific detachment. The emerald-bearing formation wasn't isolated to one spot. It extended along the entire exposed face, running parallel to the creek bed for as far as he could see. The flood had done more than cause damage. It had opened a window into one of the most significant gemstone deposits he'd ever encountered. By early afternoon, Marcus had filled 24 sample bags and taken over 300 photographs. His notebook was crammed with observations, GPS coordinates, and sketches that captured details his camera might have missed. But more than that, he'd filled himself with a certainty that went beyond professional opinion. This was the discovery that would change everything. The drive back to the campground passed in a blur of barely contained excitement and growing anxiety. Each sample in his trunk represented potential beyond his ability to calculate, but they also represented a secret he wasn't sure how to share. How could he explain to Sarah that their desperate gamble might have paid off beyond their wildest dreams? How could he make her understand that the flood-damaged wasteland she'd seen as his latest failure might actually be their salvation? He arrived at the campground to find his family returning from their tourist adventure, Emma and Sophie chattering excitedly about the fake gunfight they'd witnessed and the small pieces of pyrite they'd found while gold panning. "Look, Dad," Emma thrust her hand toward him, displaying several pieces of fool's gold that glittered bravely in the afternoon sun. "We found treasure!" Marcus looked down at his daughter's innocent excitement, then at the sample bags hidden in his trunk that might contain genuine treasure beyond anything a tourist attraction could offer. The irony wasn't lost on him. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," he said, kneeling down to examine Emma's finds with exaggerated interest. "Pyrite is actually a really interesting mineral. It forms when iron and sulfur combine under just the right conditions." "Is it worth anything?" Sophie asked with 7-year-old directness. "Not in terms of money," Marcus replied carefully, "but it's valuable because it teaches us about how the earth works. Sometimes the most important discoveries aren't the ones that make you rich, they're the ones that help you understand something new about the world." Sarah was watching this exchange with an expression he couldn't quite read. She'd looked tired from their day of family activities, but also more relaxed than he'd seen her in months. The mountain air and the girl's happiness seemed to have eased some of the tension that had become her constant companion. That evening, as they sat around their campfire, roasting marshmallows and watching the stars emerge in the clear mountain sky, Marcus wrestled with how to broach the subject of his discoveries. The samples in his trunk felt like physical weight pressing on his chest, demanding acknowledgement, but also threatening to shatter the fragile peace they'd found as a family. "Did you find anything interesting on your geological expedition?" Sarah asked as the girls chased fireflies in the meadow. Marcus felt the moment arrive like a freight train he couldn't stop. "I found some unusual mineral formations. I'll need to have them analyzed properly, but they're definitely worth investigating further." "Unusual how?" "The hydrothermal alteration patterns suggest significant mineralization. There are veins of crystalline material that I've never seen in formations like this." Sarah looked at him across the fire, her face painted in flickering orange light. "Marcus, are you telling me you think there's actually something valuable on that land?" The question hung between them like a bridge he could either cross or burn. Marcus thought about the emerald samples in his trunk, about the scope of what he'd discovered, about the careful scientific language that could either minimize or maximize the significance of his findings. "I'm telling you that I need to have these samples analyzed by a professional laboratory, and depending on what those results show, we might need to think seriously about development options." "Development options?" Sarah repeated slowly. "You mean like mining?" "I mean like protecting and properly evaluating a mineral resource that could be significant."
Chattering about the insects they'd caught and released, and the s'mores they wanted to make. Marcus used their interruption to deflect further discussion, but he could feel Sarah's eyes on him throughout the evening, studying him with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. That night, lying in their tent with his family sleeping around him, Marcus stared at the ceiling and tried to process the magnitude of what had happened.
24 hours ago, he'd been an unemployed geologist clinging to desperate hope. Now, he was potentially sitting on one of the most significant emerald deposits ever discovered in North America. But with that possibility came complications he was only beginning to understand. Mining operations required permits, environmental assessments, geological surveys, infrastructure development, all of which meant money, time, expertise, and political navigation that seemed impossible from his current position. Even if his samples confirmed what he suspected, the path from discovery to development was fraught with obstacles that could take years to overcome. More immediately, there was the question of secrecy. Significant mineral discoveries had a way of attracting attention from interests both legitimate and otherwise. Until he understood exactly what he'd found and how to protect it, Marcus realized he was walking a tightrope between opportunity and danger. The next morning brought their last day of camping and a family hike that took them to an overlook where they could see for miles across the Colorado landscape. Emma and Sophie ran ahead on the trail while Marcus and Sarah walked together in a silence that felt both comfortable and charged with unspoken questions. "Whatever you found yesterday," Sarah said finally, "it changed something in you. You look like you did when we first met, like you're carrying some wonderful secret that you're dying to share." Marcus stopped walking and turned to face his wife. Below them, the valley stretched out in patterns of green and gold, carved by geological forces that had operated over millions of years to create the landscape they were admiring. Somewhere in that vastness lay his property, holding secrets that could transform their lives or destroy them completely. "What if I told you that everything might be different now?" he said carefully. "What if the crazy gamble you were so angry about might actually have been the best decision I ever made?" Sarah looked at him for a long moment, and he saw something in her expression that might have been hope struggling against the learned caution of too many disappointments. "I'd say that I love you enough to let you explain, but I'd also say that I can't survive another failure. The girls can't survive another failure. Whatever you think you found, whatever possibilities you're imagining, we need to be absolutely certain before we let ourselves believe." Marcus reached for her hand, feeling the familiar warmth and strength that had anchored him through every challenge of their marriage. "Then we'll be certain," he promised. "Whatever it takes, however long it takes, we'll be absolutely certain." As they rejoined their daughters and began the hike back to camp, Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settling around his shoulders like a cloak. The samples in his trunk represented more than potential wealth. They represented the future of his family, the vindication of his professional judgment, and the culmination of a lifetime spent learning to read the stories written in stone. But they also represented the beginning of a journey that would test everything he thought he knew about geology, about fortune, and about the price of dreams that come true in ways too extraordinary to have been imagined.
The drive home to their ordinary life would begin in a few hours, but Marcus knew they would never really go back. Whatever happened next, they had crossed a threshold that would reshape everything that came after. The only question now was whether that reshaping would save them or destroy them completely. The return to ordinary life felt like stepping into someone else's dream. Their modest ranch house in suburban Denver looked smaller somehow, as if the vastness of the Colorado mountains had recalibrated Marcus's sense of scale. He carried the sample bags into his garage workshop with reverent care, each one a potential key to a future he hardly dared imagine. Sarah watched him arrange the samples on his workbench with the methodical precision of a man handling relics from another world. Emma and Sophie had already returned to their normal routines: video games, playground adventures, the comfortable rhythms of 7-year-old life that remained blissfully unaware of the potential transformation taking place in their garage. "How long will it take?" Sarah asked, her voice carrying a tension that suggested she was afraid of both possible answers. "The preliminary analysis I can do myself with the equipment I have here, but for definitive identification and quality assessment, I'll need professional laboratory analysis. That could take weeks." "And then?"
Marcus paused in his preparations and looked at his wife. She stood in the doorway between their house and garage like someone poised for flight, ready to retreat into the safety of routine if the answers became too overwhelming to process. "Then we'll know," he said simply. "We'll know if our lives are about to change completely, or if I'm a geologist who's lost his ability to read rock formations." The preliminary tests began that evening after the girls had gone to bed. Marcus worked by the light of his bench lamp, running each sample through a battery of examinations that had become second nature during his professional career. Hardness tests using the Mohs scale, specific gravity measurements using hydrostatic weighing, crystal structure analysis under polarized light, chemical composition screening with the XRF spectrometer. Each test confirmed what his field observations had suggested. The green stones showed the characteristic hexagonal crystal structure of beryl. Their hardness registered consistently at 7.5 to 8 on the Mohs scale. Their specific gravity fell within the narrow range typical of emerald. The XRA readings showed the expected beryllium and aluminum content, with trace amounts of chromium and vanadium that gave emeralds their distinctive green coloration. But it was the quality of the stones that made Marcus's hands shake as he worked. Even in rough, uncut form, several of the samples showed a clarity and color saturation that belonged in museum displays rather than amateur rock collections. Under his field microscope, he could see the internal structures that separated true gemstones from interesting minerals. The liquid inclusions, the growth patterns, the optical properties that would make these stones valuable beyond their rarity. By 2 in the morning, Marcus had completed his preliminary analysis and reached a conclusion that seemed too extraordinary to accept. His flood-damaged Colorado property contained what appeared to be one of the most significant emerald deposits ever discovered in North America. He sat in his garage workshop, surrounded by samples that might be worth millions of dollars, and felt something approaching panic. Professional protocol demanded that he seek independent verification before drawing any conclusions. Personal wisdom suggested that he tell Sarah immediately, rather than carry this secret alone. But practical considerations warned him that knowledge like this could be dangerous if it reached the wrong people before he was prepared to protect it. Marcus spent the next 3 days researching gemological laboratories, mining attorneys, and security protocols, while maintaining the facade of normal job searching. He contacted Dr. Elena Rodriguez at the Colorado School of Mines, a former colleague whose expertise in geology was internationally recognized. He researched law firms that specialized in mineral rights and mining development. He even began investigating private security services, though he wasn't sure yet what he would need to protect. The call to Dr. Rodriguez required careful navigation. Marcus couldn't simply announce that he'd discovered a major emerald deposit. That kind of claim demanded evidence and credibility he wasn't sure he still possessed after months of unemployment. Instead, he framed his request as a consultation about interesting specimens he'd collected during a camping trip. "Marcus Chen!" Elena's voice carried warmth and surprise when she recognized his name. "I heard about the layoffs at Meridian. I'm sorry, that company made some incredibly short-sighted decisions." "Thank you," Marcus replied, feeling the familiar sting of professional displacement. "Actually, I'm calling because I've come across some mineral samples that I'd like to have properly analyzed. I was hoping you might be able to recommend a reliable gemological laboratory." "What kind of samples?" Marcus chose his words carefully. "Beryl formations from a hydrothermal deposit in Colorado, unusual coloration and crystal structure, potentially significant, but I need professional verification." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Marcus could hear the professional interest in Elena's voice when she responded. "How significant are we talking about, and where in Colorado?" "I'd rather not discuss specifics over the phone. But if my preliminary analysis is correct, we might be looking at gemstone quality material." Another pause, longer this time. "Marcus, are you telling me you think you found emeralds?" The question hung in the air like a challenge to his credibility, his sanity, and his professional judgment.
Marcus felt the weight of his entire career balancing on his response. I'm telling you I've found barrel formations with characteristics that warrant serious gemological analysis, and I'm hoping you can help me determine exactly what I've found. Elena agreed to examine his samples personally, a decision that both relieved and terrified Marcus. If his analysis was wrong, he would be exposing himself as a geologist whose expertise had been compromised by desperation. If his analysis was correct, he would be sharing knowledge that could transform Elena's career as dramatically as it might transform his own. The drive to the Colorado School of Mines felt like a pilgrimage to a place of judgment. Marcus carried his samples in a locked briefcase, having told Sarah only that he was consulting with a former colleague about potential consulting opportunities. The lie tasted bitter, but the alternative, raising hopes that might be crushed by professional analysis, seemed crueler. Elena met him in her laboratory, a space filled with equipment that made his home workshop look primitive by comparison. She was a small woman in her 50s whose reputation for
Meticulous analysis had earned her consulting contracts with mining companies worldwide. Her expertise would either validate Marcus's discovery or expose it as the delusion of a desperate man. "Let's see what you've brought me," she said, her tone professionally neutral, but her eyes bright with curiosity. Marcus opened his briefcase and began arranging samples on Elena's examination table. He watched her face carefully as she got her first look at the stones, noting the way her expression shifted from polite interest to focused attention to something approaching disbelief. "My God," she breathed, picking up one of the larger specimens. "Where did you say you found these?" "On property I recently acquired in Colorado," Marcus replied carefully. "Flood-damaged land that exposed previously buried geological formations." Elena moved to her gemological microscope and began the same battery of tests Marcus had performed, but with equipment precise enough to provide definitive answers rather than preliminary assessments. Marcus watched her work with growing anxiety, noting every frown, every sharp intake of breath, every muttered comment that might indicate good news or disaster. After 2 hours of intensive analysis, Elena leaned back from her microscope and looked at Marcus with an expression he couldn't interpret. "Marcus, I need you to understand something," she said carefully. "What you've brought me isn't just emerald. It's an emerald of a quality that I've only seen in the finest Colombian specimens. The clarity, the color saturation, the crystal structure, these are museum-quality stones." Marcus felt the world shift around him like geological strata settling into new configurations. "Are you certain?" "Absolutely certain. I've run every test I can think of, and the results are consistent. You found genuine emeralds of extraordinary quality." Elena paused, studying his face with scientific curiosity. "The question is, how much more is there where these came from?" The conversation that followed stretched into the evening as Marcus shared the details of his discovery, the scope of the exposed formations, the apparent extent of the deposit, the geological conditions that had created and preserved such exceptional specimens. Elena listened with growing excitement, asking technical questions that confirmed her understanding of what they were discussing. "If your observations are accurate," she said finally, "you're looking at a deposit that could be worth hundreds of millions of dollars, possibly more, depending on the actual volume and distribution of gemstone quality material." The number hit Marcus like a physical blow, hundreds of millions. The amount was so far beyond his ability to process that it became abstract, meaningless in the context of his daily reality of unpaid bills and unemployment anxiety. "What do I do now?" he asked, feeling suddenly small in the face of possibilities he'd never imagined. Elena's response was immediate and serious. "You protect this information with your life. You secure legal representation immediately. You conduct a proper geological survey to determine the full scope of the deposit, and you prepare for your life to become very complicated very quickly." The drive home from the Colorado School of Mines passed in a haze of disbelief and growing panic.
$50,000 to $200,000 per carat. Marcus had collected over 24 significant specimens, some weighing multiple carats in rough form. Even conservative estimates suggested he was carrying millions of dollars worth of gemstones in his briefcase. The practical implications began hitting him in waves as he navigated evening traffic. Insurance for the stones themselves,
security for his property and family, legal protection for his mineral rights, environmental assessments before any development could begin, the logistics of extracting and processing gems from a remote location, the political and economic ramifications of announcing a major mineral discovery. But underneath all the practical concerns was a deeper realization that left him feeling unmoored from everything he thought he understood about his life. He was no longer an unemployed geologist struggling to support his family. He was the owner of what might be one of the most valuable emerald deposits in the world. Sarah was waiting for him when he arrived home, sitting at their kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. She looked up as he entered, and Marcus saw in her face the careful hope of someone who had learned not to expect good news, but couldn't quite stop herself from hoping for it. "How did it go?" she asked, her voice steady, but her eyes betraying the anxiety she was trying to control. Marcus set his briefcase on the table between them and looked at his wife, really looked at her for what felt like the first time in months. He saw the woman who had carried their family through his unemployment, who had worked extra shifts to keep their lights on, who had endured his increasingly desperate schemes with patience that had finally reached its limits. "Sarah, I need you to sit down." "I am sitting down." "I mean, I need you to be prepared for what I'm about to tell you." Sarah's face went pale. "Marcus, you're scaring me. What happened at the university? Did something go wrong with the analysis?" Marcus opened his briefcase and removed Elena's written report, placing it on the table where Sarah could see the official letterhead of the Colorado School of Mines Geology Department. Nothing went wrong. Everything went right. More right than I ever imagined possible. Sarah picked up the report and began reading, her lips moving slightly as she processed the technical language. Marcus watched her face as understanding dawned, saw the moment when the words exceptional quality and estimated value range penetrated her consciousness. "This says," she began, then stopped, looking up at Marcus with confusion. "This says these stones are worth millions of dollars?" "Conservative estimates suggest the samples I collected are worth somewhere between $8 and $12 million, Marcus said, his voice sounding strange to his own ears. "And those samples represent a tiny fraction of what appears to be available on our property."
The silence that followed stretched between them like a chasm, bridged by 22 years of marriage and threatened by the impossibility of what Marcus had just announced. Sarah stared at the report, then at Marcus, then at the samples he began removing from his briefcase. "Our property?" she repeated slowly. "You mean the flood-damaged land you bought for $425? Sarah, I think we own one of the most significant emerald deposits ever discovered in North America." Sarah continued staring at the samples as if they might disappear if she looked away. Marcus could see her mind working, processing implications and possibilities and the sheer absurdity of their situation. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a mixture of wonder and terror. "What happens now?" It was the same question Marcus had asked Elena, and like Elena's response, his answer came freighted with complexity and uncertainty. "Now we figure out how to protect what we found and develop it responsibly. Now we learn what it means to own something that could change not just our lives, but the lives of everyone around us." Sarah reached across the table and picked up one of the larger emerald specimens, holding it up to the kitchen light. The stone caught and refracted the illumination, casting patterns of green fire across the ceiling that seemed to pulse with their own internal rhythm. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." Marcus watched his wife hold their future in her hands and felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of tension he hadn't realized he'd been carrying, a sense of vindication that went deeper than professional validation. For months, he'd felt like a failure as a provider, as a geologist, as a man. Now, holding proof of the most extraordinary discovery of his career, he began to remember who he had always believed himself to be. But even as relief flooded through him, Marcus understood that their real challenges were just beginning. Discovery was only the first step in a process that would test every aspect of their marriage, their family, and their ability to navigate a world they'd never imagined entering.
The emeralds glittered on their kitchen table like fallen stars, beautiful and valuable and dangerous in ways they were only beginning to understand. The law offices of Patterson, Blackwood and Associates occupied 3 floors of a glass tower in downtown Denver, its marble lobby and understated luxury speaking to the kind of clients who dealt in millions rather than thousands. Marcus sat in the waiting area wearing his best suit, the same one he'd worn to job interviews for 8 months, and tried to project the confidence of a man who belonged in such surroundings. Beside him, Sarah clutched a leather portfolio containing documents that had transformed their lives over the past 6 months. Geological surveys, mineral rights assessments, environmental impact studies, and security protocols that read like something from a corporate thriller. The weight of their new reality sat between them like an invisible presence, changing everything about how they moved through the world. Mr. and Mrs. Chen? A woman in an immaculate navy suit approached them with the kind of smile that cost $500 an hour. Mr. Patterson is ready to see you now. James Patterson was a man in his 60s whose reputation for handling complex mining operations had made him one of the most sought-after attorneys in Colorado. His office overlooked the city with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a view stretching to the mountains, where Marcus's property, their property, held secrets that continued to astonish everyone who examined them.
"I have to admit," Patterson said as they settled into leather chairs around a conference table, "in 30 years of practice, I've never handled a discovery quite like yours. The geological reports are extraordinary." The reports he referenced represented months of careful work. After Elena's initial verification, Marcus had hired a full team of specialists to conduct the most thorough geological survey possible while maintaining absolute secrecy. Core samples from 50 different locations across their 47 acres had confirmed what Marcus had suspected from his first field observations. The emerald deposit was not only vast, but of consistently exceptional quality. "The conservative estimate," Patterson continued, consulting documents that had arrived via secure courier that morning, places the total recoverable value at $850 million. The optimistic estimate approaches $2 billion. The numbers still felt abstract to Marcus, like theoretical calculations rather than descriptions of wealth they actually possessed. $2 billion. It was enough money to buy professional sports teams, to endow universities, to reshape entire communities. It was enough money to become a different kind of problem entirely. However, Patterson continued, his tone shifting to something more serious, we need to discuss the complexities of development and the timeline for realizing this value. Over the past 6 weeks, Marcus had received a crash course in the realities of modern mining operations, environmental assessments that could take years, permit processes that involved multiple federal and state agencies, infrastructure development requiring roads, processing facilities, and security measures. The gap between discovery and revenue could stretch across a decade, even under ideal circumstances. But there was another option, one that Patterson had been exploring through carefully discreet channels. "I've been in preliminary discussions with Northstone Mining Corporation. They're one of the few companies with both the capital and expertise to develop a deposit of this magnitude. They've expressed significant interest in acquiring the property." Sarah leaned forward, her voice carrying the practical edge that had sustained their family through months of uncertainty. "What kind of offer?" $300 million. Cash payment, immediate transfer, no development risk on your part. The figure hung in the air like a physical presence. $300 million. More money than Marcus could have earned in 10 lifetimes as a geologist. Enough to provide for their daughter's children's children, to establish foundations, to become philanthropists whose generosity could impact thousands of lives. but it also represented selling a resource that might ultimately be worth 7 times that amount, trading certainty for the possibility of generational wealth that could reshape not just their family, but entire communities. "There's no pressure to decide immediately," Patterson continued, "but I should mention that maintaining secrecy becomes more difficult with each passing day. Word of significant mineral discoveries has a way of spreading, regardless of confidentiality agreements." Marcus understood the implications. Already, they'd noticed subtle changes in their daily routine that suggested their secret wasn't as secure as they'd hoped. Unfamiliar cars parked on their street, phone calls that disconnected when answered, the feeling of being watched that might have been paranoia or might have been legitimate concern. Their daughters remained blissfully unaware of the transformation taking place around them, though Emma had commented that Daddy seemed happier lately, and Sophie had asked why they were suddenly getting so much mail from important-looking companies. Sarah had managed these questions with the skill of a mother protecting her children from adult complexities, but the strain was beginning to show.
The meeting with Patterson lasted 3 hours, covering legal structures, tax implications, security protocols, and development timelines. By the time they left his office, Marcus felt simultaneously empowered and overwhelmed by the scope of decisions that lay ahead. $300 million, Sarah said as they walked to their car in the underground parking garage. "Can you even imagine that much money?" Marcus looked at his wife, seeing the woman who had supported his dreams even when they seemed to be destroying their security. "Actually, I can't. I can imagine paying off our mortgage and buying new cars and setting up college funds for the girls. I can imagine taking that vacation to Europe we always talked about. But $300 million? That's not money anymore. That's responsibility." They drove home in contemplative silence, both lost in thoughts about futures they'd never imagined possible. The Denver suburbs that had felt like the limits of their world now seemed quaint, temporary, a launching pad for possibilities that stretched beyond the horizon of their previous dreams. That evening, they made a decision that would define everything that came afterward. "We need to tell the girls," Sarah said, as they sat in their backyard, watching Emma and Sophie play on the swing set Marcus had built when they'd first bought the house. "Not everything, but something. They deserve to know that changes are coming." Marcus agreed, though he struggled with how to explain wealth of this magnitude to 7-year-olds, whose biggest financial concerns involved allowance money and the cost of ice cream. How do you tell children that their father's desperate gamble had succeeded beyond the boundaries of fairy tales? They gathered as a family in the living room after dinner, the same space where Marcus had announced his land purchase 6 months earlier under very different circumstances. Emma and Sophie sensed the gravity of the occasion, sitting cross-legged on the carpet with the serious attention they usually reserved for important announcements about bedtimes or television privileges. "Do you remember when I bought that land in Colorado? The land that Mommy thought was a crazy idea? The floodland where we went camping." "That's right. Well, it turns out that sometimes crazy ideas work out better than anyone expects." Marcus reached into his briefcase and withdrew one of the smaller emerald specimens, its green fire catching the lamplight and casting subtle patterns across the ceiling. Both girls gasped with immediate delight, reaching toward the stone with the instinctive appreciation children have for beautiful things. "This came from our land. It's called an emerald, and it's very valuable. Valuable enough that our lives are going to change in some important ways." "How valuable?" Emma asked with the directness that made Marcus smile despite the complexity of his answer. "Valuable enough that Daddy doesn't have to worry about finding a job anymore. Valuable enough that we can move to a bigger house if we want to, or travel to places we've always dreamed about visiting." The questions that followed were exactly what Marcus had expected from his daughters. Practical concerns about whether they would have to change schools, excited speculation about whether they could get a swimming pool, careful inquiries about whether this meant they were rich, like people in movies. Marcus answered as honestly as he could, while preserving the innocence that made their excitement pure rather than complicated. Yes, they would probably move to a larger house, but not until they found the perfect place. Yes, they could travel more, but they would still need to be responsible about money. Yes, they are very fortunate, but that meant they also had obligations to help other people. "Will you still be our daddy?" Sophie asked with 7-year-old logic that went straight to the heart of what mattered most. "I'll always be your daddy," Marcus replied, pulling both daughters into his lap. "The only thing that's changed is that we don't have to worry about money anymore. Everything else, our family, our love for each other, the things that really matter, those stay exactly the same." That night, after the girls had been tucked into bed with dreams of swimming pools and European adventures, Marcus and Sarah sat on their back porch and talked about the future with a freedom they'd never experienced before. Money, they were learning, didn't just buy things. It bought choices, possibilities, the luxury of making decisions based on desire rather than desperation. "I want to establish an educational foundation," Sarah said, her nursing background shaping her vision of how to use their unexpected fortune. "Something that helps kids from families like ours, middle-class families who don't qualify for need-based aid but can't afford college without going into crushing debt." Marcus nodded, feeling the rightness of using their wealth to address problems they'd experienced firsthand. "And I want to fund geological research, maybe endow a chair at the Colorado School of Mines, support young geologists who are trying to make discoveries that could benefit everyone." They talked until the early hours of morning, planning and dreaming, and slowly adapting to the reality that they would never again need to choose between paying bills and pursuing dreams. The transformation was psychological as much as financial, the lifting of constant low-level anxiety that had shaped their decisions for so many years. 2 weeks later, Marcus made the call that would determine their path forward. "James, it's Marcus Chen. Sarah and I have made our decision about the Northstone offer." "I'm listening." Marcus looked across his kitchen table at Sarah, seeing in her face the same mixture of excitement and trepidation he felt in his own chest. They had spent countless hours weighing their options, consulting with financial advisors, and ultimately listening to their instincts about what felt right for their family. "We're going to decline the buyout offer. We want to develop the property ourselves, in partnership with Northstone." The decision represented a compromise between security and potential, between immediate wealth and generational legacy. Rather than selling their discovery, they would maintain ownership while contracting with Northstone for the expertise and infrastructure needed to develop the emerald mine professionally. The partnership agreement, negotiated over the following month, gave Marcus and Sarah 70% ownership of all extracted emeralds, while Northstone provided the capital, equipment, and expertise needed for large-scale mining operations. Conservative projections suggested they would begin seeing substantial revenue within 18 months, with full production capable of generating hundreds of millions annually for decades to come. But perhaps more importantly, the partnership allowed them to maintain control over how the operation was conducted, ensuring environmental protections that exceeded federal requirements, providing jobs for local communities, and establishing profit-sharing programs that would benefit everyone involved in the mining process. 18 months after Marcus had purchased 47 acres of flood-damaged Colorado land for $425, he stood on that same property watching the early phases of construction for what would become the Chen Northstone Emerald Mine. Heavy equipment carved roads through terrain that had been accessible only on foot. Temporary buildings housed geological teams conducting the final surveys before full-scale extraction began. Security fences marked the boundaries of what experts were calling one of the most significant gemstone discoveries in North American history. Sarah joined him on the small hill where they'd conducted their first proper geological survey. the place where Marcus had confirmed his initial suspicions about the extraordinary nature of their discovery. Their daughters were exploring the construction site under careful supervision, asking endless questions about mining equipment and geological processes with the fearless curiosity of children who had adapted to extraordinary circumstances with remarkable ease.
"Any regrets?" Sarah asked, slipping her hand into his as they watched their future taking shape in the valley below. Marcus considered the question seriously. The past months had been a whirlwind of legal negotiations, security concerns, media attention, and life changes that had tested every aspect of their marriage and family. They'd moved to a larger house and an exclusive neighborhood, hired security consultants, established trust funds for their daughters, and begun the complex process of managing wealth that grew daily as news of their discovery spread through investment circles. But underneath all the complexity and responsibility, Marcus felt something he'd almost forgotten during his months of unemployment: the deep satisfaction of professional validation. The knowledge that his expertise and instincts had led to a discovery that would benefit not just his family, but everyone involved in the mining operation and the communities it would support. "No regrets," he said finally, "but I'll never take any of this for granted. 6 months ago, I was a failed geologist who couldn't find work. Today, I'm responsible for an operation that could employ hundreds of people for decades to come. That's not luck, that's responsibility." Sarah squeezed his hand, and Marcus felt the solid certainty of their partnership that had carried them through poverty and would now guide them through prosperity. "We'll figure it out. We always do."
हेलो फ्रेंड्स, आप सभी का स्वागत है जीएसटी क्लब्स क्लासेस फॉर एक्सीलेंस में। कैसे हैं आप सभी? आइए आप सभी अच्छे होंगे। मैं सभी में यहाँ पे एक न्यू वीडियो लेकर आ चुका हूँ, बेसिक्स ऑफ स्टैटिस्टिक्स। इसमें जो है हमारे जो बेसिक स्टैटिस्टिक्स की जो बेसिक टर्मिनोलॉजी है उसके बारे में हम बात करेंगे। मेरे हिसाब से अभी आप सब क्वेश्चन सॉल्व कर रहे होंगे, तो बेसिक टर्मिनोलॉजी में आपको कहीं पे भी कन्फ्यूजन हो या वर्ड समझ में नहीं आ रहा हो तो आप ये क्या कर सकते हैं, ये वीडियो को देख सकते हैं, जिससे आपको थोड़ा सा रिवीजन हो जाएगा कि कोई भी एक टर्म है उसका एक्चुअल मतलब क्या है। ठीक है।
Marcus smiled at his daughter's distillation of the Foundation's mission to its essential elements, making the world better. It was exactly what they were supposed to look for, and exactly what they had been privileged to support since establishing the Foundation 3 years earlier. The Chen Northstone Emerald Mine had exceeded every projection, producing gems of such exceptional quality that they had redefined global standards for emerald evaluation. The partnership with Northstone had evolved into something approaching a family business, with Marcus serving as chief geological officer and maintaining hands-on involvement in every aspect of the operation. But more than the wealth it generated, the mine had become a model for responsible resource extraction. Environmental protections that exceeded federal requirements had actually enhanced the quality of emerald recovery by preserving the geological conditions that created the finest specimens. Profit-sharing programs had transformed the local economy, turning former ranch hands into skilled miners whose expertise was sought by operations worldwide. The Foundation represented Marcus and Sarah's commitment to ensuring that their extraordinary fortune served purposes beyond their family's comfort. Educational scholarships had supported over 300 students pursuing degrees in geology, environmental science, and related fields. Research grants had funded breakthrough discoveries in sustainable mining techniques. Community development programs had revitalized rural Colorado towns that had struggled since the decline of traditional agriculture. Sarah entered the office carrying coffee and the satisfied expression of someone who had spent the morning in productive meetings. Her role as the Foundation's executive director had evolved naturally from her nursing background. The same skills that made her effective at patient care translated perfectly to managing complex philanthropic operations. The university meeting went well, she announced, settling into her chair with the easy confidence of someone who had grown comfortable wielding significant influence. They're ready to break ground on the Chen Center for Sustainable Geology in the spring. The research center represented a 5-year, $50 million investment in geological education that would combine traditional fieldwork with cutting-edge environmental protection techniques. Marcus had envisioned it as the kind of program that might have changed his own career trajectory, offering students the opportunity to pursue discoveries that benefited both scientific knowledge and environmental stewardship. Dr. Rodriguez will direct the center, she continued, referring to Elena Rodriguez, whose initial verification of Marcus's samples had launched their entire journey. She's particularly excited about the field research component. Elena had become not just a close friend, but a key advisor in the Foundation's scientific initiatives. Her expertise in gemology had proved invaluable as the mine developed quality control standards that had made Chen Northstone emeralds the most sought-after gems in the international market. Speaking of field research, Marcus said, consulting his calendar, "I'm taking a group of graduate students to the mine site tomorrow. Want to come along?" It was a tradition he'd established shortly after the mine reached full production, monthly visits that allowed promising young geologists to observe active extraction operations and understand the practical applications of their theoretical studies. Many of these students had gone on to careers that advanced sustainable mining practices worldwide. Emma looked up from the scholarship applications with immediate interest. "Can we come too? I want to see the new extraction area." Sophie abandoned her drawings with equal enthusiasm. "And I want to collect samples for my mineral collection."
Marcus felt the familiar warmth that came from sharing his passion with his daughters. Both girls had developed genuine appreciation for geological sciences, though their interests had taken different directions. Emma was fascinated by the mathematical precision of crystalline structures and mineral formation processes. Sophie was drawn to the aesthetic beauty of geological specimens and their potential applications in art and design. "Of course you can come," Marcus replied. "But remember, we're there to learn and observe, not just to collect pretty rocks." "Dad," Emma said with 12-year-old exasperation, "we know the difference between geological education and souvenir hunting." That evening, as the family prepared for their monthly mine visit, Marcus found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this point. Their current house, a custom-designed home on 50 acres outside Boulder, featured Marcus's expanded laboratory, Sarah's art studio, and bedrooms for Emma and Sophie that reflected their evolving interests and growing independence. But perhaps more importantly, their home had become a gathering place for the extended community that had grown around their foundation and mine operations. Graduate students working on research projects, environmental scientists developing new protection protocols, artists creating works inspired by the beauty of geological formations, and local families whose lives had been transformed by the economic opportunities the mine provided. The dinner table conversation that night reflected the complexity of their current lives. Emma reported on her advanced mathematics coursework and her application to participate in a summer geology program at the Colorado School of Mines. Sophie shared her excitement about an art exhibition featuring her mineral-inspired paintings and jewelry designs. Sarah discussed the Foundation's latest research grants and the progress of scholarship recipients. Marcus talked about new extraction techniques that could maximize emerald recovery while minimizing environmental impact. It was the kind of conversation that would have been unimaginable during those desperate months of unemployment, when their dinner discussions had centered on unpaid bills and the stress of economic uncertainty. Yet Marcus was careful to remember that earlier version of their family, using that memory to guide decisions about wealth and responsibility. "How many families like ours are sitting around tables tonight worrying about money?" he asked his daughters, a question that had become a regular part of their dinner routine. "Millions," Emma answered immediately. "That's why the Foundation matters." "And why can't we take any of this for granted?" Sophie added, gesturing around their comfortable dining room with an awareness unusual for someone her age. The next morning brought perfect weather for their mine visit. clear skies that would allow excellent visibility of the geological formations, comfortable temperatures that would make the site tour pleasant for the graduate students joining them. Marcus loaded his field equipment with the same care he'd used during his professional career, though now his investigations served educational rather than survival purposes. The drive to the mine site never failed to evoke memories of that first desperate journey when Marcus had risked their family's grocery money on a gamble that seemed insane to everyone except him. The access road had been completely rebuilt, transforming what had been a barely passable track into a modern route that could accommodate heavy equipment and tour buses alike.
The mine itself had evolved into something approaching a small city. Administrative buildings housed the geological teams responsible for ongoing surveys and quality control. Processing facilities used state-of-the-art equipment to extract and prepare emeralds for market. Environmental monitoring stations tracked air and water quality with precision that exceeded regulatory requirements. Worker housing provided comfortable accommodations for the skilled miners whose expertise had made the operation internationally renowned. But at the heart of the complex was the original excavation site, where Marcus had made his first discoveries. The exposed geological formations had been carefully preserved and expanded, creating what amounted to an outdoor geological museum that demonstrated the extraordinary conditions required to produce emeralds of such exceptional quality. Dr. Chen, called Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the mine's current chief geologist and one of Marcus's former students. Perfect timing. We've just uncovered a new vein in Section 7 that shows some unusual characteristics. Marcus felt the familiar excitement that came with geological discovery, the sense of anticipation that had driven his entire career. Even with financial security assured, the intellectual thrill of understanding the Earth's processes remained as compelling as ever. The graduate students followed them to the new excavation site with the eager attention of people witnessing history in the making. Marcus explained the geological forces that had created the emerald deposits, pointing out the evidence of hydrothermal activity, the pressure conditions that had formed the crystal structures, and the unique combination of factors that had made this particular location so extraordinarily productive. The emeralds from this new vein show interesting variations in chromium content, Dr. Walsh explained, holding up a specimen that caught the sunlight with internal fire. We think it might represent a different episode of mineralization, possibly separated by several million years. Marcus examined the stone with the trained eye of someone who had spent decades learning to read the stories written in crystal formations. The subtle differences in color and clarity suggested variations in the chemical conditions present during formation, providing insights into the geological history of the entire region. "It's beautiful," observed Sophie, her artist's eye appreciating qualities that complemented but differed from her father's scientific assessment. "The green is deeper somehow, more mysterious. That's the vanadium content. Different trace elements create different color variations even within the same basic mineral family." As they toured the expanded operations, Marcus was struck by how thoroughly their discovery had transformed not just their family, but the entire community. The mine employed over 400 people directly, with hundreds more working in supporting industries. The small town of Willow Creek had grown from a struggling agricultural community to a thriving center of geological education and emerald commerce. Local restaurants served mine workers and tourists who came to visit the Geological Museum and Educational Center. Jewelry shops offered pieces ranging from affordable emerald accent pieces to museum-quality specimens worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. The high school had added advanced geology courses that prepared local students for careers in the mining industry. But perhaps most significantly, the environmental protection protocols developed at the Chen Northstone operation had become the industry standard for responsible mining worldwide. Techniques pioneered at their site were being implemented by mining operations on every continent, reducing the environmental impact of resource extraction while often improving the quality of recovered materials.
During lunch at the mine's visitor center, Marcus found himself in conversation with Maria Gonzalez, the environmental engineering student whose scholarship application Emma had reviewed that morning. Maria was spending her summer working at the mine as part of the Foundation's internship program, gaining practical experience in environmental monitoring and protection. "This place isn't anything like what I expected from a mining operation," Maria said, gesturing toward the carefully landscaped grounds where native plants had been restored around all the facilities. "In Pueblo, we grew up thinking mines were just about destroying the environment for profit." Marcus nodded, understanding her perspective based on Colorado's complicated mining history. "That's exactly why we wanted to do things differently. Profitable resource extraction and environmental protection don't have to be contradictory goals. The monitoring systems you've developed here could revolutionize how we approach industrial environmental protection," Maria continued, her excitement evident. "I'm hoping to write my senior thesis on applications for these techniques in urban pollution control." Such conversations had become routine for Marcus, as the Foundation's scholarship recipients brought fresh perspectives and innovative ideas to the challenges of sustainable development. The investment in education was generating returns that went far beyond the immediate benefits to individual students. As the afternoon progressed, Marcus led his tour group to his favorite spot on the property, the hill where he'd first stood with Sarah and watched the early phases of mine construction. From that vantage point, the scope of what they had created was fully visible: the careful integration of industrial operations with environmental protection, the educational facilities that were training the next generation of responsible geologists, and the community development that had transformed an entire region. Emma and Sophie joined him on the hill as the graduate students continued exploring the lower elevation sites. At 12 and 11, they had developed a sophisticated understanding of their family's responsibilities and the legacy they would someday inherit. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't bought this land?" Emma asked, her question carrying the kind of hypothetical curiosity that had always characterized her approach to complex problems. Marcus considered the question seriously. Without his desperate gamble, they would likely still be struggling with financial uncertainty. He might have eventually found employment, but probably in a position that utilized only a fraction of his expertise. Their daughters would have grown up with the limitations imposed by economic anxiety rather than the opportunities created by extraordinary wealth. But more than that, the emerald deposits would have remained undiscovered, their potential value locked away until some future geological event exposed them to someone else's investigation. The environmental protection techniques they had pioneered would not exist. The educational opportunities they had created would not be available to deserving students. The economic transformation of rural Colorado communities would not have occurred. I think about that sometimes. But then I remember that geological discoveries don't happen by accident. Someone has to be looking. Someone has to understand what they're seeing, and someone has to have the courage to act on their convictions. Sophie nodded with the wisdom of someone who had grown up understanding that their family's fortune came not from luck, but from the intersection of preparation, expertise, and willingness to take calculated risks.
Besides, she added, if you hadn't bought the land, we never would have learned that being rich isn't about having money. It's about what you do with it. As the sun began to set over the Colorado mountains, painting the sky in shades that rivaled the beauty of the emeralds hidden in the earth below, Marcus stood with his family and reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. From unemployment to stewardship, from desperation to responsibility, from financial anxiety to philanthropic influence, their story had become something larger than personal triumph. The Chen Northstone Emerald Mine would continue producing wealth for generations to come, but its greatest legacy lay not in the value of gems extracted, but in the model it provided for responsible resource development. The Chen Foundation would support thousands of students over the coming decades, but its most important contribution was the demonstration that extraordinary fortune could be transformed into extraordinary service.
Marcus looked at his daughters, now confident young women who understood that privilege came with obligations, and felt the deep satisfaction of someone who had successfully navigated the transition from desperate gambler to responsible steward. Emma would likely pursue geological research, carrying forward the family's commitment to environmental protection in resource extraction. Sophie would probably combine her artistic talents with her understanding of geology, finding new ways to make the beauty of the earth accessible to broader audiences. Sarah joined them on the hill as the last light faded from the sky, her presence completing the family circle that had survived unemployment, discovered extraordinary wealth, and learned to wield influence responsibly. Together, they watched the lights come on across the mine complex, illuminating the ongoing work of extracting treasures from the earth while preserving the environment that had created them. "Any regrets?" Sarah asked, echoing the question she had posed years earlier when their journey was just beginning. Marcus considered everything they had gained and everything they had learned. The financial security that allowed them to pursue their deepest values rather than merely surviving, the opportunity to support education and environmental protection on a scale that could influence global practices, the privilege of demonstrating that extractive industries could coexist with environmental stewardship, the responsibility of managing wealth that grew daily and would continue growing for decades to come. "No regrets," Marcus replied, his voice carrying the certainty of someone who had found his life's purpose in the most unexpected circumstances. "But I'll never stop being grateful for that moment of desperate courage that brought us here." As they walked back to their car, passing the geological museum where tomorrow's scientists would learn about responsible resource extraction, Marcus felt the profound satisfaction of someone who had transformed personal crisis into community benefit. The desperate unemployed geologist who had risked grocery money on flood-damaged land had become the steward of one of the world's great mineral treasures and the benefactor of educational opportunities that would shape the future of environmental protection. The emeralds that had made their fortune would eventually be exhausted, their deposits mined to completion over the coming decades. But the legacy of responsible extraction, environmental protection, and educational investment would continue long after the last gem was recovered from the Colorado mountains. Emma and Sophie would inherit not just wealth, but the knowledge of how to use it wisely. Future scholarship recipients would carry forward the commitment to environmental protection and scientific advancement. Communities throughout Colorado and beyond would benefit from the economic development models pioneered at the Chen Northstone operation. As they drove home through the mountain darkness, Marcus reflected on the circular nature of his journey. Unemployment had led to desperate risk-taking, which had led to extraordinary discovery, which had led to wealth and responsibility, which had led to educational investment that would train the next generation of geologists who might make discoveries even more significant than his own. The earth still held secrets waiting for people with the expertise to recognize them and the courage to pursue them. Somewhere out there, another desperate professional might be considering an investment that seems irrational to everyone except themselves. Another geological formation might be waiting for the perfect combination of circumstances to reveal its treasures. Another family might be on the verge of a transformation that would test everything they thought they knew about fortune and responsibility. Marcus had learned that the most valuable discoveries were not just the ones that created wealth, but the ones that created understanding of the Earth's processes, of human responsibility, and of the obligation that comes with extraordinary good fortune. The emeralds had made them rich, but the journey of managing that wealth responsibly had made them wise. In the end, that wisdom might prove to be the most precious treasure of all. 10 years later, The morning sun cast long shadows across the campus of the Chen Institute for Applied Geology, its modern glass buildings rising from carefully preserved natural landscape like crystalline formations emerging from bedrock. Marcus stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office, watching as hundreds of students from around the world began another day of classes that would shape the future of sustainable resource extraction. What had begun as a modest research center had evolved into one of the world's premier institutions for geological education, attracting the brightest minds from 6 continents to study techniques that could revolutionize how humanity interacted with the Earth's resources. The original $50 million investment had grown into a $2 billion endowment that supported research, education, and community development projects on a scale that rivaled major universities. "Dad, you're going to be late for the board meeting," Emma called from the doorway, her voice carrying the affectionate exasperation of an 18-year-old who had inherited her mother's gift for organization. She stood in the entrance to his office wearing the burgundy blazer of the Chen Institute's senior student, her arms full of research papers that represented her final project before graduating with dual degrees in geology and environmental engineering. "Let them wait," Marcus replied with a smile, though he began gathering the documents he would need for the morning's discussions. "At my age, punctuality is less important than perspective." Emma laughed, a sound that reminded him of Sarah's laughter from their early years together. "You're 52, Dad. That's hardly ancient by academic standards." But Marcus felt the weight of those years, not as a burden, but as accumulated wisdom. The desperate, unemployed geologist who had risked everything on flood-damaged land had been transformed by experience into someone whose opinions carried influence in capitals around the world. Government officials sought his advice on mineral policy. Environmental organizations valued his insights into sustainable extraction techniques. Educational institutions competed for partnerships with the Chen Institute and its revolutionary approaches to geological training. "Besides," Emma continued, settling into one of the leather chairs that faced his desk, "Dr. Martinez wants to discuss the South American expansion project, and you know how he gets when we keep him waiting." Dr. Carlos Martinez had joined the Chen Institute 3 years ago, bringing with him expertise in Andean geology that had opened possibilities for educational partnerships throughout South America. His proposal to establish satellite campuses in Peru and Colombia represented the kind of international development that could transform geological education across entire continents. "The Martinez project is exactly why these board meetings matter," Marcus replied, though he remained at the window, reluctant to abandon the view that never failed to remind him of how far they had traveled from those desperate months of unemployment. "We're not just funding education anymore. We're shaping how entire regions approach resource development." Through the window, he could see the latest addition to the campus, a state-of-the-art laboratory complex that recreated geological conditions from around the world, allowing students to study mineral formation processes in controlled environments. The facility had cost $60 million, but represented an investment in understanding that could prevent environmental disasters and maximize resource recovery for generations to come.
Emma joined him at the window, her presence a reminder of how profoundly their family had been shaped by the journey from financial desperation to international influence. At 18, she possessed a sophisticated understanding of both geological science and global economics that would have impressed graduate students when Marcus was beginning his career. "The Colombian government is offering some interesting incentives for the Bogotá campus," she said, referencing materials she had clearly studied in detail. "Tax advantages, land grants, and partnerships with their national university system. Dr. Martinez thinks we could be operational within 2 years." Marcus felt the familiar excitement that came with contemplating new projects, though it was tempered now by the wisdom that came from managing complex international operations. The Chen Institute's existing partnerships in Australia, Norway, and South Africa had taught them valuable lessons about the challenges of establishing educational programs across different political and cultural contexts. What about the environmental assessment requirements? Marcus asked, testing his daughter's understanding of the regulatory complexities that govern international development projects. Already in progress, Emma replied immediately. Dr. Martinez has been working with local environmental groups to ensure our operations meet standards that exceed Colombian requirements. He's particularly excited about the opportunity to study emerald formations in their geological context. The mention of emeralds brought Marcus's thoughts back to the Colorado mine that continued to generate the wealth supporting all their educational and philanthropic activities. After 10 years of operation, the Chen-Gemstone partnership had produced over $4 billion in emerald sales while maintaining environmental protection standards that had become the global benchmark for responsible mining. But perhaps more significantly, the mine had become a living laboratory where new extraction techniques were developed and tested before being implemented by mining operations worldwide. The environmental monitoring systems pioneered in Colorado were now standard equipment in dozens of countries. The profit-sharing programs that had transformed local communities had been adapted by mining companies on every continent. Speaking of emeralds, Emma continued, Sophie's latest jewelry collection is generating some interesting attention. The Milan fashion shows featured several pieces that incorporated our stones into designs that ordinary people could afford. Sophie, now 16, had developed her artistic talents into a business that bridged the gap between high-end jewelry and accessible beauty. Her designs used smaller emerald chips and fragments to create pieces that captured the essence of their mine's treasures while remaining within reach of middle-class consumers. The psychological impact of making such beauty accessible had proved as valuable as the economic benefits. She's also been working with the Foundation's scholarship program, Emma added, some kind of art therapy initiative for students dealing with financial stress. Marcus nodded, feeling the deep pride that came from watching his daughters develop into young women who understood that privilege came with obligations. Sophie's artistic gifts had evolved into a tool for emotional healing, while Emma's analytical mind was being trained to address environmental challenges on a global scale. The board meeting that followed brought together representatives from educational institutions, environmental organizations, mining companies, and government agencies from around the world. These quarterly gatherings had become forums for addressing some of the most complex challenges facing sustainable development in the 21st century. Dr. Martinez presented his South American expansion proposal with the passionate precision of someone who understood that geological education could transform entire economies. His slides showed potential sites for the Bogotá and Lima campuses, educational partnerships that could train thousands of local students, and research opportunities that could revolutionize understanding of Andean mineral formations. The geological diversity of the Andes represents one of the world's great natural laboratories. Volcanic activity, tectonic forces, and hydrothermal processes have created mineral formations that could teach us entirely new approaches to resource extraction.
Board member Dr. Sarah Kim, representing the Korean Institute of Mining Technology, raised practical questions about political stability and long-term security for international educational investments. Her concerns reflected the hard-learned lessons of operating in regions where government policies could change with little warning. The political risks are real, Dr. Martinez acknowledged, but that's exactly why educational partnerships matter. Training local expertise creates stakeholders who will protect these programs regardless of political changes. Marcus listened to the discussion with the attention of someone who had learned to balance visionary thinking with practical concerns. The Chen Institute's success had been built on the foundation of their Colorado emerald mine, but its long-term impact would depend on their ability to create sustainable educational programs that could survive and thrive independently of their financial support. "I'm inclined to approve the South American expansion," Marcus said finally, "but with specific benchmarks for political stability, environmental protection, and educational outcomes. We're not just investing money, we're investing reputation and credibility that took years to establish."
The vote was unanimous, authorizing a $100 million investment in facilities and programs that could transform geological education throughout South America. As the board members dispersed to continue their work around the world, Marcus felt the satisfaction that came from decisions that balanced ambition with responsibility. That afternoon brought a visit to the emerald mine that had made everything else possible. The drive through the Colorado mountains never failed to evoke memories of that first desperate journey when Marcus had risked their family's security on a geological intuition that seemed insane to everyone except himself. The mine complex had continued evolving, now encompassing not just extraction operations, but research facilities, educational programs, and environmental monitoring systems that served as models for the global mining industry. Tour groups arrived daily from around the world, studying techniques that had proven profitable resource extraction and environmental protection could coexist successfully. Sarah met him at the mine's administrative headquarters, her role as Chief Environmental Officer representing the evolution of her career from nursing to global environmental policy. Her expertise in systems management had proved invaluable in developing the monitoring protocols that ensured their operations maintained the highest possible standards. The latest environmental report shows continued improvement in all metrics, she reported, her satisfaction evident in both voice and expression. Water quality, air quality, soil preservation, wildlife habitat restoration, everything trending positive after 10 years of operation. Marcus reviewed the data with the appreciation of someone who understood that environmental protection was not just morally necessary, but economically beneficial. Their careful extraction techniques had actually increased the quality of recovered emeralds by preserving the geological conditions that created the finest specimens. More importantly, Sarah continued, the techniques we've developed here are being implemented by operations in Colombia, Brazil, Zambia, and Afghanistan. The global environmental impact of our innovations is starting to show measurable results. They walked together through the extraction areas, where careful excavation revealed emerald formations with the precision of archaeological work. The miners, many of them graduates of the Chen Institute's training programs, combined traditional expertise with cutting-edge technology to maximize recovery while minimizing environmental disruption. Emma and Sophie joined them for the site tour, their presence a reminder of how thoroughly the mine had become part of their family's identity. Both daughters had grown up understanding that their prosperity came not from luck, but from the intersection of expertise, environmental responsibility, and commitment to community benefit.
The new extraction site is showing some unusual characteristics, reported Dr. Jennifer Walsh, whose expertise as chief geologist had made her one of the world's leading authorities on emerald formation. We're seeing evidence of multiple mineralization episodes that could extend our productive capacity by decades. Marcus examined the latest core samples with the trained eye of someone whose geological expertise had been refined by years of practical application. The emerald formations showed variations that suggested their deposit was even more complex and valuable than original estimates had indicated. "It's like the Earth keeps revealing new secrets," Sophie observed, her artist's perspective complementing the scientific analysis. "Every time we think we understand everything, there's something else to discover." The observation was more profound than Sophie might have realized. After 10 years of intensive study, the geological processes that had created their emerald deposit continued yielding new insights into mineral formation, environmental preservation, and sustainable extraction techniques. The mine had become less a source of wealth than a source of knowledge that benefited the entire global mining industry. As evening approached, the family gathered at their favorite overlook, the same hill where Marcus had first stood with Sarah, watching the early phases of mine construction. The scope of what they had created was now fully visible. Extraction operations that served as global models, research facilities that advanced scientific understanding, educational programs that trained experts from around the world, and community development initiatives that had transformed the entire region. 10 years ago, I never imagined it would become this complex, Sarah reflected, her voice carrying the wonder of someone still adjusting to the scope of their influence. "We thought we were just developing a mine. Instead, we've created an entire industry for responsible resource extraction." Marcus nodded, understanding her amazement. Their original goal had been simple survival, finding a way to support their family after his unemployment had threatened their financial security. The discovery of emeralds had seemed like salvation, but the real transformation had come from learning to manage extraordinary wealth responsibly. "The complexity is what makes it meaningful," Emma observed, with the insight of someone who had grown up watching her parents navigate the challenges of transforming fortune into service. "Anyone can spend money, but creating systems that continue generating benefit long after the original investment is exhausted, that's actually difficult." Sophie, now 16, and increasingly thoughtful about their family's legacy, added her own perspective. "I think the most important thing we've done is prove that business success and environmental protection don't have to be contradictory. People always assumed you had to choose between profit and responsibility." The conversation continued as darkness settled over the Colorado mountains, their words accompanied by the distant sounds of mining operations that continued around the clock, using techniques that minimized environmental impact while maximizing resource recovery. Floodlights illuminated extraction areas where careful work continued the process of revealing treasures that had been hidden in the earth for millions of years. "What do you think Dad's greatest achievement has been?" Sophie asked Emma, the question carrying the kind of retrospective curiosity that had become common as they reflected on their extraordinary journey. Emma considered the question seriously, her analytical mind weighing options that ranged from the original geological discovery to the educational institutions they had established, to the environmental innovations they had pioneered. "I think it's proving that expertise matters more than luck," she said finally. "Dad didn't accidentally find emeralds. He recognized geological conditions that suggested valuable mineral deposits, and he had the courage to act on professional knowledge that everyone else dismissed as crazy." Marcus felt the deep satisfaction that came from his daughter's understanding of the principles that had guided their entire journey. Geological expertise, environmental responsibility, educational investment, community development. All of these had grown from his conviction that professional knowledge could be transformed into beneficial action. But as they prepared to leave the mine site and return to their Boulder home, Marcus reflected on how thoroughly their story had transcended personal achievement. The Chen Institute now educates thousands of students annually. The Chen Foundation supported educational opportunities that had transformed individual lives in entire communities. The mining techniques they had pioneered were being implemented by operations worldwide, reducing environmental impact while improving resource recovery. 20 years from now, Marcus said as they walked back to their car, when the emerald deposits are finally exhausted, what will be our real legacy? "The knowledge," Sarah replied immediately. "Everything we've learned about sustainable extraction, environmental protection, and responsible wealth management, that will continue benefiting people long after the last emerald is removed from these mountains." "The people," Emma added. "All the students who've been educated through our programs, all the professionals who've been trained in sustainable mining techniques, all the communities that have been transformed by responsible resource development." "The proof," Sophie concluded. "Proof that extraordinary good fortune can be transformed into extraordinary service, that private wealth can generate public benefit, that individuals can create positive change on a global scale." The drive home through the mountain darkness was accompanied by the comfortable silence of a family that had learned to find meaning in service rather than consumption. Their house in Boulder expanded over the years to accommodate Marcus's research laboratory, Sarah's environmental consulting office, and spaces for Emma and Sophie to pursue their developing careers, represented stability rather than ostentation. Marcus parked in their garage beside the workbench where he had first analyzed emerald samples 10 years earlier. The same geological equipment sat ready for use, though now it served educational rather than survival purposes. Graduate students from the Chen Institute regularly used his facilities for research projects that advanced understanding of mineral formation and environmental protection. Inside the house, they found evidence of the evening's activities that had become routine. Graduate students had gathered in Marcus's study to discuss research proposals. Environmental policy experts had used Sarah's office to review monitoring protocols. Local high school students participating in the Chen Foundation's mentorship program had worked with Emma and Sophie on projects that combined scientific analysis with artistic expression. The refrigerator door displayed artwork from Sophie's latest jewelry designs alongside Emma's research proposals for graduate study in environmental engineering. Family photographs showed their evolution from the struggling family of 10 years earlier to the internationally recognized leaders in sustainable development they had become. But perhaps most significantly, the evening mail included updates from scholarship recipients around the world, young people whose educational opportunities had been made possible by the Chen Foundation's support. Maria Gonzalez, the environmental engineering student whose application Emma had reviewed years earlier, was now Dr. Maria Gonzalez, leading pollution control initiatives in major cities throughout Latin America. Her work had prevented environmental disasters and improved public health for millions of people.
Similar stories arrived regularly from the Foundation's global network of scholarship recipients. The young geologist from Bangladesh, who had developed techniques for detecting mineral deposits that could provide economic opportunities for impoverished communities. The environmental scientist from Nigeria, who had created monitoring systems that prevented industrial pollution while supporting economic development. The mining engineer from Australia, who had designed extraction equipment that minimized environmental impact while maximizing resource recovery. "This is why it all matters," Marcus told his daughters as they reviewed the latest updates from scholarship recipients. Individual success, family prosperity, even business achievement, those are just the beginning. The real purpose is creating opportunities for other people to make discoveries and innovations that benefit everyone. Emma and Sophie read the updates with the serious attention of young women who understood they would soon inherit responsibility for continuing their family's philanthropic mission. Their questions demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the challenges facing sustainable development in different cultural and economic contexts. Dr. Gonzalez's pollution control work in Mexico City could be adapted for use in other major urban centers, Emma observed, her engineering background helping her recognize applications for innovations developed in one context. The techniques she's developing could potentially improve air quality for hundreds of millions of people worldwide. Sophie, approaching the intersection of art and environmental science that was becoming her specialty, added her own insight. And the community engagement strategies she's using could help other environmental scientists communicate more effectively with local populations. Making scientific information accessible is just as important as developing the science itself. As the evening progressed, the family settled into the comfortable routine that had evolved over years of balancing international responsibilities with personal relationships. Marcus reviewed research proposals from Chen Institute faculty members whose work could advance understanding of geological processes worldwide. Sarah consulted environmental monitoring data from mining operations that had implemented their sustainability protocols. Emma worked on her senior thesis, examining applications of sustainable extraction techniques for critical mineral resources. Sophie designed jewelry pieces that would make emerald beauty accessible to middle-class consumers while supporting fair trade practices. It was the kind of evening that would have been unimaginable during those desperate months when Marcus was unemployed and their family struggled with basic financial security. Yet the continuity of family relationships, the shared commitment to learning, the mutual support for individual achievements, the common understanding of responsibility that came with privilege remained constant despite the transformation of their circumstances. Before retiring for the night, Marcus returned to his study and opened the locked filing cabinet where he kept the original emerald samples. the stones that had confirmed his geological intuition and launched their extraordinary journey. Under his desk lamp, the emeralds still caught and reflected light with the same internal fire that had captured his imagination 10 years earlier. But now he understood that the real treasure had never been the emeralds themselves. The real treasure had been the knowledge, the relationships, the opportunities for service, and the proof that expertise combined with courage could transform individual crisis into community benefit. The emeralds had provided the financial foundation, but the lasting value lay in everything they had built upon that foundation. Marcus closed the filing cabinet and turned off his desk lamp, satisfied with another day spent transforming wealth into wisdom, fortune into service, and individual success into opportunities for others to achieve their own discoveries and innovations. The story that had begun with $425 and a desperate gamble had become a testament to the power of expertise, environmental responsibility, and commitment to education. It continued through the lives of scholarship recipients worldwide, the advancement of sustainable mining techniques, and the ongoing demonstration that extraordinary fortune could be transformed into extraordinary service to the global community.
As Marcus prepared for sleep, he reflected on the circular nature of discovery and development. Somewhere around the world, another geologist might be analyzing samples that could lead to breakthrough discoveries. Another family might be facing financial challenges that would test their resilience and creativity. Another mineral formation might be waiting for the perfect combination of expertise, courage, and commitment to reveal its secrets and transform individual lives into opportunities for community benefit. The Earth still held wonders worth discovering, and the Chen family's mission would continue through future generations who understood that the greatest treasures were not the ones that made individuals wealthy, but the ones that created opportunities for everyone to benefit from the careful, responsible development of our planet's extraordinary resources. Marcus Chen fell asleep in his Boulder home, surrounded by evidence of a life well lived and responsibilities well met, knowing that tomorrow would bring new opportunities to transform knowledge into service, wealth into wisdom, and individual achievement into lasting legacy that would benefit communities worldwide for generations to come. What an incredible journey from unemployment to extraordinary wealth. If this story inspired you, please like this video, share it with someone who needs hope, and subscribe for more amazing real-life stories of triumph against all odds.